This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the music of Ludwig Van Beethoven. I have Ed Chang, and he has a blog about Beethoven and is a music expert. And we will be talking about not just Beethoven's life, but about the music and hopefully giving some excerpts. So please join us. The subject is Beethoven. Ed Chang is my guest. As I said, we're going to do a little bit non-traditional here and just talk a little bit about the music. But before I do, I always like to give my guests a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. Ed has a blog, or had a blog, it's been a few years outdated now, called The Daily Beethoven, LVB and more. So Ed, if you can, give a little background about yourself and also your interest in Beethoven.
So I've spent most of my adult life as a musician, composer, primarily in rock, jazz, free jazz, experimental music, moving more and more towards progressive areas. And at a certain point, I realized I didn't know that much about classical music. I mean, or at least late or pre-Debussy classical music. And I came into the possession of a box set of Beethoven's piano works. Mm-hmm. And I'm a sucker for box sets. Yeah. And whenever I get something like that, I kind of want to do it some justice and really dig deep into it, because it's right there. So I started really listening to the stuff, and then I ended up getting a complete works of Beethoven because I liked what I heard. I wanted to hear more, and obviously he had done symphonies, string quartets, all kinds of piano works. So I eventually just dived deeper and deeper into his discography, so to speak. And it turns out that you can buy a complete discography of Beethoven's works on like 85 to 100 CDs for like $50 or something like that. Wow. I mean, classical music is pretty economical to buy in box sets. Yeah. So anyways, so I had all this, I had a background in like rock and jazz, and so I had a kind of interest in rhythm and texture. But then listening to Beethoven was a different kind of animal because Beethoven is more about melody and harmony and structure, and those are kinds of things which, as I've gotten more and more progressive in my personal musical taste, I kind of left that behind, or kind of given that aspect of music short shrift. So I almost had to relearn how to listen to music when I was listening to Beethoven's work. A lot of people who I knew didn't really like classical music that much. I guess there's a sense of it being dated or old-fashioned, especially in the more progressive circles, I guess. But I was really curious to know like why this guy was so famous. Why this guy he died in 1827, and his music is still played like every day, several times a day. And then as I dug deeper and deeper into his mythology and his discography, I realized that his music is very much a modern music and has a large place in today's musical landscape. And the process of doing the blog was I needed to have an outlet, or rather some kind of discipline in which I could force myself to teach myself how Beethoven's music worked. So I kind of gave myself a challenge. And I'd never done this kind of thing before, this kind of writing project. But I decided to do a blog entry a day on Beethoven. So my goal was to every day write some kind of feature on Beethoven, not necessarily like a whole article. I might feature a video, or I might feature a little editorial about his place in music. I might feature some gathered facts about his life. And it covered all kinds of aspects. It also covered people's tributes to Beethoven, remixes of Beethoven. I'd start doing my own remixes of Beethoven. Because I gave myself the mission of doing 365 articles on Beethoven. It was really a challenge to keep coming out with interesting things, and it forced myself to really grow a lot, both as a blog author and as a listener and as a educator in a way. Because one of the multiple reasons of doing the blog was both to educate myself and to promote Beethoven's music to a public who might not be as aware of his relevance today. So that was essentially the main thrust of how the blog started and how I kept it going. And since then, I've done other blogs on other artists, and which make my Beethoven blog, which is now, I believe, 5 or 6 years old now.
Yeah.
And that looks like antiquated now compared to my more recent blogs. But since the Beethoven blog, I started doing blogs on Stockhausen, who's a famous 20th century avant-garde composer, who also was a huge Beethoven fan and actually did lectures on Beethoven string quartets. But he's also another maverick of music. And I've done a blog on Alan Holdsworth, who is an electric jazz guitarist, rock jazz guitarist, who also, I think, turned the world music around within his stylistic space. And I basically wrote a kind of an online book describing every record that he put out, and it was about 30 chapters. But anyways, getting back to Beethoven, the Beethoven thing kind of opened up my ears to new approaches to appreciate music, and it's been very rewarding.
Well, let me ask you, Ed. I was born in 1965. 2 weeks from today, as we're recording, I'll be 53. So I grew up, my first musical consciousness. Well, probably little songs watching on TV and whatnot. But I remember the early 70s. There was a lot of singer-songwriters. This was the era of Led Zeppelin and hard rock, and then disco came along and whatnot. And I remember in my grade school, I had a music teacher named Mr. Freudenberg, and I remember him telling me that none of this pop music would last, and that classical music has lasted because it's more complex, it's richer, it's deeper, and as you get older, you'll appreciate it more. And I found that he was basically right in broad strokes. I mean, not that I don't appreciate. I just recently did last month a show on the Beatles and their music. I grew up on Led Zeppelin and hard rock, heavy metal. I'm not a big concert goer, but of the 15, 20 concerts or so that I've gone to in my life, pretty much most of them have been rock and roll. Do you find yourself that one of the attractions to classical music in general, and Beethoven specifically, is the sheer complexity of the music? When I listen to these symphonies, over the last year I've gotten into classical music because I've been writing plays, and I wanted to use music in ways differently. I got plays where I use a Bach toccata fugue, or I'll use Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in ways to emphasize a character. And it's so rich and so deep. Do you think that my old music teacher was correct in the sense that classical music is richer and deeper than the thump, 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 thump of pop music, be it rock or pop or even jazz to a degree?
Well, I don't want to say one is better than the other. I think, on the face of it, classical music definitely has more moving parts.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, rock music is essentially 4/4, and it only has a few key modulations, if any, within a song. The structure is basically verse, chorus, bridge, solo, chorus, solo out. It's very simple, and the melodies are kind of presented as if they've been lit up in neon. I mean, you have like in rock music, you have the most simplified form of popular music, which is a rhythmic, even beat, simple chord progression, and vocal harmony, which is just belted out to make people want to sing along, essentially. Whereas classical music is the same thing, except that it's much more, like you said, more complex. It's almost like going from a two-dimensional line to a three-dimensional shape, sculpture or something. It's there's a lot more texture. There's a lot more combinations of instruments. There's a lot more, I guess what you could say, articulations over a melodic line. There's a lot more variations. It's really two different kinds of phenomena in a way. For example, let's put it this way. They both started out in similar with the same function, but they kind of developed differently. And let's start with the classical music in general. Mm-hmm. Classical music started out as basically dance music as well. It's waltzes. It started as accompaniment for different kinds of state and country dances, as well as music for state functions and music for church, for religious functions. And it was never used for your iPod or something like that, right? I mean, there was no recordings in those days. There was no CDs, no tapes, nothing. It was either you only got to hear music when you went to church or to a parade or to a what should we call that, ball, or if somebody in your family played the piano, and then that person would just play like these simple pieces or whatnot. So music had a very functional aspect to it. But then what happened was during Beethoven's time, he kind of I'm not sure if he led this direction, but he definitely was a big part of it. But music became an actual art instead of a craft. Yeah. Like, for example, in Haydn's time, or even Mozart, you could say, music is kind of a craft. It's like a very ornate cabinet or something. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's designed with a specific function. Whereas with Beethoven, he started creating music for its own sake. It didn't necessarily have to be danceable. It would tell us his own story. I mean, Beethoven was, in a way, a kind of a punk rocker in that he didn't feel the need to follow the fashions.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point that you just made there. One of the things, my wife, for example, is a fan of the movie Amadeus, and when I did the Mozart show, I had 3 experts on it, and for about 10, 15 minutes, we went off on a digression about Mozart and Beethoven, who was better. Obviously Beethoven was influenced by Mozart, who came first. But the thing that there's always the idea that Mozart was sort of heavenly and whatnot, and Beethoven was more like that grunge rocker. He was sort of the Kurt Cobain of but there is something when you listen to his music that in if you think of like the big 3 and that would be Bach, Mozart, Beethoven chronologically. Bach, has these organ fugues and you get this sense of him being a part of the earth or whatnot. And then you get Mozart, and Mozart is seemingly up in the heavens. But then it's something about Beethoven in his music. It's complex. It's constantly moving, and I think of the Emily Dickinson poem that says to the effect that the mind is greater than the universe because the mind contains the universe. And Beethoven sort of internalizes all of these things that were put out there by Bach or Mozart and puts his own spin on it. I get a sense that I know, and it may be false, that I know Beethoven as a person, the way his mind works, more than I do than Mozart or Bach. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And what accounts for that?
Well, the most simple, one-line answer to that would be dynamics. Bach didn't write dynamics. Everything was the same volume, and Mozart only had like 3 volume settings on his pieces, whereas during Beethoven's time, they started to really go crazy with the directions on how to play these instruments. They started really developing articulations and new notations. All kinds of things. But that's like the very technical, simple answer. That it was louder and softer than Bach or Mozart. But I think what's probably more important. It's the fact that Beethoven was very human. Beethoven's kind of was worshipped as a hero, right? And when I first heard about that, you're not sure why. He's just like a hero. But then you kind of read about his life, and he really it's almost like he's a fallen god come down to earth in a way. And I'll tell you why I say that. Beethoven grew up as a prodigy. He kind of met Mozart or whatever. That's kind of it's not actual proof of that, but they say he did. But anyways, but Mozart was supposedly impressed, and then Beethoven eventually moved to Vienna and became essentially the Jimmy Page or the Eddie Van Halen of Vienna. He was basically the gunslinger. There was in those days, what the court would sponsor would be these duels between pianists. And these duels, they weren't like playing set pieces, like Sonata No. 5. They would usually do improvisations, dueling variations on themes or whatnot. And Beethoven was the best. He cleared competition. He would be pitted against the so-called best pianist in town. And Beethoven would, mop the floor up with the guy. He was, and he knew it. He wasn't humble about it either. Beethoven was never humble about anything. So, anyways, and I'll give you one small story which I love. There was one competition. Beethoven was challenged by a pianist. This pianist comes in, brings in his theme, places it on the piano, and plays it. Then he does variations on it or whatnot, and then he goes up for 10, 15 minutes or whatever, and the crowd applauds or whatnot. He does a good showing. Then Beethoven comes over, takes the sheet of music, turns it upside down, and plays it straight, and then does the variations on the upside down version of this previous pianist's sheet music, and blows him away. On first sight, So it was like that kind of a thing. He was really kind of a celebrity in that way. So then, what happens? He's making some money. He's getting commissions and whatnot. But then he starts going deaf. And that's absolutely the worst fate of a performer, go deaf, especially one who had as competitive a spirit as Beethoven. So Beethoven goes through this phase of depression, and he goes to Heiligenstadt. There's this famous document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which was discovered after he died, but he kept it for some reason. But it's a long letter. It's pretty easy to find on the internet. But he it's basically kind of a therapeutic suicide note in a way. He's debating whether or not he should go on because he's losing his hearing. I mean, it's a big blow. So it's kind of like Beethoven was such a high level of musicianship and regard with such a bright future. Then he's going deaf, which of course limits a lot his performances, ability to hear music and whatnot. So he's dramatically humbled by this, and essentially what happens is, in the course of writing this letter, this self-therapeutic document, he says, I have to go on. I can't end it. I must go on because the music demands me to go on. And so he kind of rises again. And the rest of his life is kind of another struggle against the onset of deafness. And another thing with the deafness is he didn't become deaf like overnight. It was a slow process. He started hearing buzzing in his ears and weird high frequency noises or whatnot, based on what people say. But he could still hear. But it wasn't until over a course of 20 or 30 years that he really became completely deaf, and he would have these ear trumpets or whatnot, which I don't know if they helped or not. But eventually he had to retire from his performing career, and the famous story is that he tried to conduct his Ninth Symphony during his premiere, and he was off on one. Because he couldn't hear what the band were playing. But anyways, it's a heavy stone to bear if you're going deaf and you want to continue your music career. So to me, he's very human because he went from such a great height, almost an arrogant height, down to a totally despondent deaf, and then has to work himself back up. And throughout the rest of his life, he was, had stomach problems, and colds, and money problems, and romantic problems.
Well, let me just ask you: do you think maybe the deafness and the fact that, especially as he got older, I talked about the internalization. Do you think that a part of the richness of his music were these internal kind of noises that aren't really noises, but the impulse to music? I mean, I could imagine if not being able to hear, still being able to go bum 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 or whatever, and that he's hearing these internal things that are coming from the depths of his mind, and that maybe is why his music is so rich.
Well, I think it's possible that his music might have probably progressed in some ways due to that, because there was no performer limits to what he could hear. I'm not sure if, I guess what you're saying is that because he could hear it in his head, his music became more down to earth. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, it became more internalized. For example, I'm a writer, and I'll often get ideas just rhythmically coming into my head. I don't have any musical ability, but with words, with poetry, alliteration, I'll get those things. And I know people who are painters, and they will get images. Not that they'll get images in their mind first, and then they project them out onto a canvas, or if they're a filmmaker. And I'm just wondering if 200 some years ago he was doing a similar thing with the music internalized within him, spinning around in his head, rather than just being inspired by listening to birds tweeting. He was inspired by some deep, dark, or some part of his psyche.
I'm not sure. There's a kind of mythology. There's behind great artists. You want to make them out to be saints or something. Or saints, or either they're totally evil, crazy people, or they're total saints. There's all these poles. where people like to pigeonhole their heroes. But Beethoven was actually a fairly down-to-earth guy with fairly simple thoughts. So I think he was more almost like a scientist slash prankster. I mean, he would do things. Now, hopefully, I'm not going off track here from your question too much, but he would do things like write pieces of music which would cause people to cry, and then he would just laugh at them for being so easily manipulated. You know, I mean, it's not necessarily like he was struck by an incredible poetic spirit to make him write something, but sometimes that did occur. But I think it's hard to really say that all of his deep works were inspired by a deep thought. Or I think his ability, his genius at structure and at organization of sounds and textures is probably more relevant to the craft, and that's probably true of most composers. I mean, a lot of people like to say simply the poetry, but something in his childhood or whatever. But in reality, in reality, it has to do with the skill. There's a lot of sweat. There's a lot of hard work at these things. You know, it's not like you get thunderstruck with, a deeply cathartic thought and then it flows out of you. I mean, I get that happens sometimes, but for the most part, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of learned skills on how to create, a complex piece of work. You know, like a symphony. Look at a full score page of a symphony. It's a lot of notes. There's like 50,000 notes in one of those things, and so it's you don't just wake up one morning and dash it out. You have to sketch it out. I mean, Beethoven is known for his voluminous sketches. He used to carry a notepad, I guess, like one of those memo pads, those flip memo pads. I mean, he would actually make them himself. Kind of thing. He would just like fold them up or whatever. But he would walk around and he'd hear a melody in his head. He would jot it down in this little pad, and there were like hundreds of these pads. I mean, he'd be walking around the countryside, humming and then writing down these notes. And you can buy, books where they have photocopies of these notes, and then they show you like this is what it looks like in real music. It's really interesting. It's like he was writing down his so-called lick dictionary. Like if you're a guitar player, you have licks. I mean, like rock guitar players. You can buy books about the 50 best rock licks. The guitar phrases.
Well, let me jump off there because Ed, let me just jump off here because you had said you wanted to do something with some music. So I'm gonna play some stuff off of YouTube. I'll play it loud enough that you can hear some of it. And like when you're talking about guitar licks or guitar riffs and whatnot, I had mentioned earlier before we started how the thing that amazes me about a lot of classical music, but especially Beethoven, is how much of the music that I know of was him, and I didn't know it was Beethoven until I started listening to it. So I want to play a lick here, or maybe 10 or 15 seconds of something here, and I'm sure you'll recognize this one. And then I want to see if you can tell me what you think makes this interesting and memorable, or good, or great, or whatnot. So let's see if it works here. So this is something from Beethoven, and I gotta wait here 5 seconds before I can skip the commercial. Okay, skip ahead. There we go. Can you hear it?
Sure. That's Moonlight.
Yeah. So now we'll just play that for a few seconds. Now that's one of those things that throughout the whole piece, dum 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 dum. And that's one of those things that's one of his more simpler pieces, just to my unexpert ear. But it's something that I didn't know was Beethoven until I started listening to Beethoven. So what about even a simple piece like that is so Beethoven about it? You know?
Well, first of all, Moonlight is it's a jaw-dropping piece. I mean, it sounds simple, but if you consider like when he wrote that, I mean, there was nothing like that. I mean, that's Moonlight is basically, I mean, like Philip Glass. You've heard of Philip Glass,
Yeah.
right? He built his whole career on copying Moonlight Sonata, essentially. I mean, if you listen to modern film music, like Batman or whatever, you know, I mean, basically Moonlight started all of that. It's a stunning piece of work. It practically, prefigures, minimalism, ambient music, modern electronic film music. It's something else, and it's just has a deceptively simple structure to it, but it also proves that you don't need to have a lot of notes and a lot of dynamics to make something really strong. And I think at the time when that came out, there was nothing like that really. I mean, I don't know what were the exact circumstances of him writing that. Moonlight was not something that he came up with. That was just like the publisher. I mean, He hardly ever came up with names for his pieces. They were always like number 1, number 2, number 3. It was always the publishers who came up with the names. Or they would like find he jotted down like a word in the corner of one of his scores, and like on page 26 he wrote down the word tempest, or wrote down a quote from Shakespeare, and then that became the Tempest Sonata. And it has nothing. Beethoven, I'm sure, would be like, oh, whatever. But anyways, there's that movie, Immortal Beloved, something with Gary Oldman, and I guess in that movie it's kind of presented as if he wrote this for some female student to learn as a simpler piece. I mean, who knows? It's hard to say really, unless there's actual documentation that I don't know about. But that piece, I mean, as a drop in like the early 18th century, that's a needle drop of that piece in the early 18th century is unheard of. I mean, it's the hypnotic element of it. I mean, it also prefigures Pink Floyd, you could say. You could practically put Moonlight Sonata in the middle of Dark Side of the Moon, and it would probably, it would probably work.
Now, I want to go to now, just so people know, and I'm not a musical expert. Sonatas are basically standalone small pieces. They're de facto sort of like classical singles, right?
Well, I guess technically, sonata is it's a piece that has usually 3 to 4 sections. Usually, it opens with a up-tempo fast section. Then there's like a more light, danceable section, and then there's a slow, introspective section, and then there's a finale, which is more up again. That's a classical form, which is used in symphonies. I mean, basically everything. But a sonata, I guess, would be considered a chamber piece for solo piano, or for piano with violin, piano with cello, that kind of thing.
So the next piece I want to play about 15-20 seconds of is called the Kreutzer Sonata, and it says Sonata number 9, Opus 47. So let me see if this one here. So this is YouTube. So let's see. Here we go. Okay, and this is Anne Sophie Mutter on violin. So hopefully it'll come up here. Let's go. Okay, let's move it on. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Now this goes 45 or so minutes. Here we go. So now the Kreutzer Sonata, like you said, the Moonlight Sonata, I think the basic, the most famous part of it is only like 4 or 5 minutes. This Kreutzer Sonata, the various videos that I'm looking at, it's anywhere from 32 to 45 minutes or so. So that is a longer, more complex piece than the Moonlight Sonata.
Well, I guess. I mean, it's longer.
Yeah.
The Moonlight Sonata has 3 movements, and the Kreutzer has 4.
Uh-huh.
If I got that right. I mean, it's been a long time, actually. Well, also, the Kreutzer has 2 instruments, and the Moonlight has 1. So I think just based on the number of notes, there's more in the Kreutzer. But I mean, they're both. I mean, I don't know. You can't. It's hard to say like the one is more complex than the other. I mean, I'm not sure how you would quantify that really. I mean, they're both stunning pieces. I mean, the third movement of Moonlight is barnstorming. You know, the Kreutzer about 20 seconds after you stop that excerpt, it was going to go crazy.
Yeah.
It was going to go punk. You know, yes, I'm sure you know, it was going to go off the hook.
Now, when we think of his overall works, did he start out doing the smaller, less complex pieces? Obviously, as a young man, he's not going to have the full faculty that he did as he aged. His 5th and 7th and 9th symphonies, the more famous symphonies, were these written like in the last decade of his life?
Yeah. Well, basically, it's this is another aspect of Beethoven, which I think is pretty cool. He was one of the first businessmen of classical music, or one of the first punk rock DIY types.
Yeah.
And he started out as a student of Haydn and would do these little recitals and whatnot. Then he would get to know some of the royalty, and start getting commissions for them to get like some sonatas or string quartets or whatnot. But eventually he started to write symphonies, and then by the time he got to the 4th, 5th symphonies, he was doing his own concerts. I mean, he was basically booking his own halls,
yeah,
selling tickets out of his house, and hiring all the musicians, and basically producing his own show, just like punk rockers do now, I guess, or alternative musicians or whatnot. Before that, you would always have a concert as long as it was put on by the king or something, or at the church. But Beethoven started renting out halls, and of course, there was a lot of disasters. Like there was this one concert where he was in the dead of winter. He realized he forgot to I don't know, turn the heat or something. I forget the details, but there was something in the room where it was freezing cold, and he didn't think of that. So everybody was there for like this 4-hour course, freezing their asses off, but there was a premiere of like it was some incredible concerts. The Fifth Symphony, then he did a piano piece, then like the choral fantasy, which is like a kind of like a piano concerto. Then he did the Sixth Symphony. I mean, it's like that one, that's a hell of a show.
Yeah.
Some killer pieces.
Well, I want to talk about the Fifth Symphony in a little bit, but before we get into some of the more complex works, I want to play another famous, rather short piece that's only a couple of minutes. I'll only play about 20 or 30 seconds of it, and that's the Für Elise piano version. So let me just see if I can get this up here. Okay. It almost seems that like a lot of these pieces, and again, I'm not a musical expert, they start off with the little hook, with the little 4 or 5 notes that are played over and over again for 10 10, 20 seconds, and then you get a little bit of fluttering off in a different direction, and then you get a little bit more fluttering, and he comes back and he starts. He'll go back to the bass, and then he starts adding little things, and it gets more complex each time he comes and cycles back to something.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's how music is developed. I mean, essentially you have themes, and then you do variations of those themes. I mean, that's all what music boils down to. And there's different degrees of variations which make up a structure. For example, like in a typical sonata allegro form, which is the basic form, I guess, which is also used in like rock music, verse chorus, solo, chorus, whatnot. I mean, it's still, you have one harmony and one theme, and then you do a variation B, then you go back to the first version, then you go back to the variation B, and then you do a variation C, and then you go back to variation A. So it's like A, B, A, B, C, A. And they're different themes, but they all have things in common. They have common, harmony structures. And then like a piece like For Elise, it's more like straight variations, whereas he takes a melody and then he develops the same melody. It's like A, then A with something else, then A a little bit tilted, then A kind of shaded differently. That's basically how music is created. It's how far variations go from your basic idea. Like something like the Fifth Symphony, da 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 da. I mean, that's the whole piece right there, da 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 da. That's it. That's the Fifth Symphony. Everything in that, every note from the Fifth Symphony is built from da 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 da.
Yeah. But the amazing thing is when I listen to it, and I think the major part, the most famous part, is like 7 or 8 minutes, and the da 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 da, and the only piece of music, classical or otherwise, that probably maybe even comes close to being as instantly recognizable as that, well, maybe "Smoke on the Water" by Deep Purple to a degree, but is the toccata, the Bach's toccata in Fugue B or whatever, with that the Halloween kind of with the organ music or whatnot. But when I've listened to it many times. There's always something that you get the adumbration, I guess you'd call it, or and it comes back and it cycles back 3 or 4 times. And this is something that is so complex and so tight and so, I mean, it's just like all perfectly put together. It's just an amazing piece of music.
I can talk about the Fifth Symphony.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, like, again, that's part of the craft. It's part of. I mean, it's not like it didn't come to him in a dream. It took him years to develop, and through a kind of almost a mathematical or scientific discipline to get to that stage. I mean, music composition in music partly it's magical and poetic, but like I said before, a lot of it's perspiration and using the learned skills you've developed over years of repetition and study. Okay. And the great thing about the Fifth Symphony is that it starts out with such a simple motif. That's what's the hook on that guy. Yeah. It starts out with an amazingly simple motif, but then it's like it's not over. He keeps it going for several minutes, and that's down to Beethoven's skill, his craftsmanship in putting together a whole architecture based on this one brick. It's like he's built a whole cathedral out of this one arch. Well,
Ed, in the email you sent me earlier today, you said you wanted to do some of your favorite pieces. So why don't you tell me a favorite piece, and I'll Google it, and I'll try to play it. Is there?
All right, hold on. Let me. Let's try. All right. Why don't you put on the Coriolan Overture for a little bit?
How do you spell that?
Coriolan.
Coriolan, and that's the Coriolan. What is that?
Overture.
Overture. Okay. Overture. Let's see here. So Beethoven. Okay, so Beethoven Coriolan Overture. The first one is 9 minutes 12 seconds here. So let's try
You can
that
play
one.
the first bit, first 30 seconds.
Okay, well let's see here. Hopefully we don't. Okay, okay. Conductor's at the stage here. Here he's ready. Okay. Well, that's about 45 seconds, but it's interesting.
Right.
Just as an amateur here, you can. He has that similar. Bum, bum, bum. It's like pay attention. I'm going to give you something.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's dramatic. It's bold strokes, like large, big arm movements. It's not small movements. It's big movements.
Yeah.
And he uses silence in there too.
Yeah.
I mean, there's pile drivers, and then a pause, a pregnant pause.
Yeah.
The more pile drivers, then it starts grooving. That's like modern film music right there. There was an experiment I did way back when I took the Coriolan Overture and I put it with Lord of the Rings when Gandalf is going to fight, the orcs or whatever, and it worked perfectly. I think there's a video of that on YouTube, and it just does not sound dated. It doesn't sound like it's a couple hundred years old at all. It works perfectly. So that's one of those things where I think it just shows how timeless Beethoven's music is. It's still good.
Well, let me just ask you something. Now that you mentioned it, the Fifth Symphony and just listening to this, it's true that Beethoven does have those boom and those dramatic pauses. And I know, having listened to Mozart, and famously in the Amadeus film, several people say, he uses too many notes. He's filling up everything. What is that? One of the things you think that is a difference, perhaps, between Beethoven and Mozart is that Beethoven used silences and for dramatic purposes. He more than Mozart or better than Mozart, perhaps.
Well, it's just a development of the form. If Mozart had lived another 30 or 40 years, he probably would have incorporated more silences too. Yeah. It's just all the composers are kind of like we got our ear to the ground and we're like, oh wow, he's using distortion on that. Maybe I'll give that a DST plugin to try too. There's like you never want to say, but you very hardly ever want to say this guy was the first to do this or that. It's almost always false. There's usually a trend in the air, whereas two or three people are kind of moving in the same direction. It's just so sometimes I want to say Beethoven was the first to do this or the first to do that, but I try not to because he probably wasn't. There's probably some guy in some farm with his little piano.
Well, yeah, and it's similar to like people when they talk about Shakespeare, and they'll talk about, well, Shakespeare was the first to coin this word. But I know as a writer, just by the context, say, of in one of Shakespeare's plays, that he's probably just echoing what the people of the day were saying. So in other words, he was maybe the first and his lasted the longest that it was in print. But these were the common sayings of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. I mean, there's like an atmospheric trend. I mean, you'll hear in history this guy, I don't know, if you go to art, right? Kandinsky was so-called the first person to create abstract art, but then you find out there's like 3 or 4 other guys who are doing it at the same time, and there's always like this kind of zeitgeist where people move towards a certain thing. It's almost like a kind of a mind meld or something. But as far as like getting back to the Mozart thing, Mozart did great for his time, but then he died. So if he hadn't died, he probably would have been a big competitor with Beethoven. I'm sure he would have appreciated the better orchestras, the better pianos, and he probably would.
And it should be said, from everything I've ever heard from people, is that Beethoven was, one of Mozart's biggest fans. He said, "Wow, Mozart was great, but I'm going to be greater," kind of thing. He used him as an inspiration.
Oh, sure. I mean, Beethoven was a crazy, very arrogant guy. I mean, this is probably before he went deaf. Like he was very arrogant. I mean, he would. There's another. Haydn is, of course, the father of the symphony. I mean, he's one of the most famous composers ever. Actually, underrated, come to think of it. But anyways, Beethoven came to Vienna to study under Haydn, right? And so Haydn would give him assignments to do. But Beethoven, he didn't really like Haydn's assignments. It's kind of like if you were going to study under Jimmy Page or something, right? And Jimmy Page is giving you these things that you're supposed to be doing, and he'll continue teaching you. But Beethoven was like, he was cheating. I mean, he would actually take pieces from his teenage years and give them to Haydn and pretend he just wrote them, and because he wanted to do something else, he ended up studying with some other guy, I mean, Beethoven he just wanted to do what he wanted to do. He didn't respect hardly. I mean, he was kind of moody too. Sometimes he would say, "This guy is the greatest," but then, a couple weeks later, he'd be like, "Oh, that's crap." I mean, he was very changeable in his opinions and things. He's very known for that, very, whimsical, moody.
Well, let me ask you, do you have another piece that you might want to?
Sure. Well, why don't you see if you can find Fantasia in G minor.
Fantasia in G minor. Okay, let's see this. Okay, Beethoven, Fantasia in G minor, Rudolf Serkin, opera, Opus 77 here. Well, let's try this one here. Okay, let's see, here it comes. Okay, we'll do about. Well, that's about 40 seconds of that. And, right, what came to my mind is there are echoes of like the Moonlight Sonata, but there's much more of those dramatic pauses there.
Well, not only that, but, you have that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like modern 20th century music right there. That's like, I think Bartok, right?
Mm.
It's like he's using like a lot of, so-called out notes, in these runs, and then he's kind of alternating between like these almost abstract shapes and then these kind of pastoral shapes. So it's he's giving you your medicine with some sugar, I mean, he always wants to push harder and farther out harmonically. He doesn't want to scare you off either. I mean, there's a lot of pieces where he does get pretty nasty.
Yeah, the Bartok comparison is good because one of the things that I've enjoyed about listening to Bartok is sort of the jaggedness, sort of like, it's broken pieces of glass listening to him. And I can see where this is sort of like proto that almost.
Oh, yeah. Also, Bartok was a huge Beethoven fan.
Yeah.
Bartok used to play Beethoven for his concerts. I think you can listen to it online. But there's a Library of Congress concert with Bartok, and oh gosh, I should know the violinist. It's probably insulting somebody by forgetting the name. But anyways, Bartok played his own pieces, and then followed up with the Kreutzer Sonata, which that other piece that you had played before. And you can actually hear that online. I'm not sure if it's on YouTube or whatever, but yeah, I mean, Bartok loved Beethoven. He was a huge. I mean, every composer worth their salt is a huge Beethoven fan in my book. I mean, everybody. It's.
Well, let me ask you for one final one, a third piece that maybe I can look up here. One that's just. Is the one that you can recommend, Ed?
What's that?
A third piece there, because that Fantasia in G minor, I may have heard it once before, but it's not one of the more familiar ones. Is there another piece maybe that you could recommend us? Which one?
Why don't you try? How about Seventh Symphony, Second Movement?
Okay, so let's see. Seventh Symphony, Second Movement. Okay, let's see now. Okay, here we go. There's about 7 minutes here, so let's listen to this here. This is the Allegretto here.
Right.
Well, that's almost the first minute. The immediate picture I got in my mind was I felt almost like there was an injured wolf or an injured bear just sort of lumbering around the forest looking at things there. I don't know, that image came to my mind. It felt that there was some big force or presence in that music, and it was just sort of lumbering, looking around. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very serious piece of music, and the reason I picked that is because that piece of music is used in a lot of films today, and all kinds of genres. Like, for example, there's a movie a couple years ago called The King's Speech with Colin Firth. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
So while the king was reading his speech, the one that would decide the fate of the world, they were playing as the background music to his speech. It just lends a lot of gravity to it, right? And then on the total opposite end of the spectrum, I think last year or 2 years ago, there's a superhero film called X-Men Apocalypse, where they're these superheroes who are fighting some blue monster or something, and they use that same piece of music in X-Men. As there was a scene where some guy with psychic powers somehow managed to launch a whole bunch of nuclear missiles, and these nuclear missiles were exploding in the air and whatnot, and it was kind of like this doomsday scenario. And so again, that there's another movie with Nicolas Cage called Knowing. In that movie, I forget exactly, but somehow he knows the end of the world is coming. And then and then the end of the world starts happening, and then there's chaos on the streets, to rioting and whatnot. And Nicolas Cage is driving in his car through these rioting crowds, and it's just silent except for the Beethoven piece. Da, 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 da. I mean, it's such a strong piece that it just puts all the music composers out of business. if Mozart, Beethoven was alive today, he should be collecting loads of royalties on this music. There's another film called Phantom Thread with Daniel Day-Lewis just came out. Daniel Day-Lewis plays a fashion designer, and that film doesn't actually have an actual Beethoven piece in it, but whoever composed the score took themes from Beethoven's piano concertos and did variations on them. And every time I heard like him start one of these soundtrack, these film score pieces, I kept thinking, oh, that's from Concerto Number 4. So Beethoven's music is just so it's so human, and we're still human as he was back in those days, and it's just it's so universal. It's
yeah. Well, before I start wrapping up, I want to play a little section from the Ode to Joy from the Ninth Symphony, and just listen to about a minute of that, and then get your comments on that. So I'm going to click on here, Beethoven Ninth Symphony, Movement 4, Ode to Joy. It's 22 minutes here on YouTube, but let's see here. Folsom Symphony, and this was from 2012, so it should come on here. Okay, here we go. Now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so this is a bit more down. I'm going to skip ahead a couple of minutes here. See? I just want to get to one of the more... Yeah, here we go. So, I mean, that's probably the most famous portion of that. Da, 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 da. And that's one of those things. And the thing that, again, to the amateur ear like my own, that to me is a very Mozartian piece. But again, there's something, Beethoven is scraping inside his own guts. There's more blood in that than, and it's not to diminish Mozart, because Mozart is fantastic. His 10, 12, 20 most well-known pieces are just mind-blowing pieces of music. But for me, Beethoven, there's more guts into it somehow. I don't know what it is. Is it the arrangement? Is it the dramatic pauses, or what?
Well, it's a kind of he kind of is manipulating you there.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
And I don't mind being manipulated when it's that good.
No, I'm gonna tell you why. That's an amazing symphony. I mean, it's when he was writing that, right? He was kind of washed up in a way. Like they were like, do we want to invite Beethoven to the party? Nah, he's kind of old hat, And people like Rossini would come in, and he'd be like, "Where's Beethoven? How come you didn't invite him to the party?" And they'd be like, "Oh, well, he's kind of he's old hat, And then Beethoven would hear about these disses, Yeah. And he was working on the Ninth Symphony, and then he would say to his friend, "Well, wait till they get a load of this," And then true to his word, it blew them away, and now it's essentially it's an anthem of the EU. But anyways, the movement, that was the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony, and I can go on for a half an hour on each of those movements. But just in brief on that last movement, it starts out in a kind of a theatrical dialogue, and see what happens is the first movement, right? It starts out with da 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 da, and then the second movement is like a march. I can't really sing very well, but you get the idea. It's a march. Then the third movement is this very hymnal kind of slow piece, right? Now in the fourth movement, it goes da da la 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 da. And it goes da 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 da. That's like a question. And then there's like a reply by the other instruments. Basically, the first 30 seconds is kind of like a conversation between the low and the high instruments. And then they're like kind of saying, where do we want to go? What do we do now, right? And then one guy says, how about this? And then they start playing the first movement again. Da 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 da. And then they go, no, cut that off. I mean, they just cut it. Like as if stopping the tape.
Yeah.
And then another guy goes, how about this piece? How about this thing? And then they play like 30 seconds of the second movement. I mean, it's like a little play. It's like that Beethoven was sampling himself.
Right. And let me just pick up on that, because I believe when I've listened to the whole thing, which goes, I don't have it up now, but it's 30 or 40 minutes. The da 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 da, that starts out, I think the first time we hear it in the whole symphony, it starts out very soft and low. It doesn't and it's almost like a prefiguration of the thing. And to me, it's almost like, oh, here's man sort of in his own mind, da 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 da, and then at the end we get the voice of God, ba 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 ba, the same thing, but 100 times louder and grander.
Oh, sure. I mean, you can absolutely think of it that way.
Yeah.
I guess the way I think of it is more like, these two characters are saying, let's do this. Yeah. Let's go back to the first part. No, that's no good. How about the second part? No, that's no good. How about this third part? No, that's good. Then what's next? What do you got? And then one person goes, how about, this kind of like one little guy is going, well, I got this one thing in the back of my pocket. It goes, and then the other guy is like, oh, that's not bad. Let's maybe we can roll with this. Yeah. And then some other people, how does it go again? Da, 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 da. And then like everybody, yeah, this is good. And then everybody joins in and starts singing it. And then that's kind of like the skit. It's like a little play. And then this kind of play is repeated with vocals. When the vocals come in, it's again kind of repeats this kind of dramatic arc. And then later on, another great thing about the fourth movement, then there's a little interlude. There's a just as it's about to go into this full blown parade mode or whatever. Suddenly everything stops and you have this cabaret band pop up, and some like three or four musicians come in like a marching band, and they start playing these like parade drums, the one you walk around with, and it's just like this kind of like vaudeville routine suddenly interrupting the thing, and then that goes away, and then they go back to the orchestra. I mean, it's really funny. I mean, if you look at it and know like all the shapes that are being bandied about, it's really funny, and there's so many tricks that he does. I absolutely appreciate the fact that Beethoven's orchestrations have such a strong emotional effect on people. I mean, that's part of his incredible skill, his craftsmanship on how to orchestrate and how to array his forces, like his army of musicians, into creating such a strong sound. But for me personally, once you get past the incredible power of his melodies, then you get to like funny bits, the clever bits, the parts where you're like, what? How did that happen? Or you just start laughing out loud when you start listening to some of this music, because you hear things where you're just like, was that a mistake? Like, no, he did it again. I guess that wasn't a mistake. Yeah. Or he would do things like, that's not allowed. Well, he did, so I guess it is allowed. You know, there's all these little jokes. He was really a funny guy. Really winks at you a lot. And then once you get to a certain point, you'll appreciate that stuff even more.
Well, let's begin wrapping up here, and I wanted to just ask. I mentioned Amadeus, the movie about Mozart that won an Oscar 30-some years ago, and probably Beethoven is right up there with Mozart in terms of current pop culture. I mean, most famously in the Charles Schulz cartoons and comic strip, the Schroeder character has the little Beethoven bust on his little piano, and then in Clockwork Orange, famously, Alex the Droog refers to Ludwig Van, and listens to in both the book and the film of the book, listens to Beethoven, and Beethoven has this image that's the movie Amadeus made Mozart out to be sort of this wacky guy who likes to fart, whereas Beethoven always has that. There's the most famous painting where he's like, he's the angry Beethoven, the scowling Beethoven, sort of looking down on the infidels or something. Do you think that, other than the actual music, do you think that the image of Beethoven has been a large part of propagating him?
Propagating him?
Meaning like making him generations since, the 8 or 10 generations since, attracted to him because he's sort of this angry genius.
I don't know. I think I guess that's possibly part of it. I mean, I know in the early 19th century, in the decade after he died, he was worshipped as as a hero. Practically as like a godlike figure. I mean, there's statues of him being put up every couple of days or something. Yeah. People would devote whole careers to like rewriting Beethoven pieces. Liszt did all that. Wagner conducted Beethoven. I mean, like I said, every Beethoven is still played every single day now by 3 or 4 conductors a day. So there's this kind of, he's a hero. He overcame deafness. I mean, even if he wasn't deaf, he's incredible, right?
Yeah.
So he definitely has his hero. But now, as far as like the angry stuff, I mean, like he was deaf. I mean, if you went around with cotton stuck in your ears and tried to go out to a bar and try to meet your friends, believe me, you would get frustrated after a while. It's tough. It's tough. So I don't blame him for being angry. I'm not sure this aspect of him being angry would be part of his allure. I think it's really still his music and the fact that it's just strong and it speaks to people. It has a very personal feel. Like you said, I think you were saying before we were filming that Beethoven spoke to you. Like it's as if Beethoven is talking to you personally. He's like, I guess the story or the stereotype is that Bach or Mozart, they're playing music to God or whatever, and Beethoven is playing music to man, and it's so true. He's speaking to us as an equal. He's like, I've had tough times, and you've had tough times, and we'll get through this together, or you made it, and let's celebrate. He's very much very human, whereas a lot of these other composers are at such a lofty kind of mood. It's almost like they're ideal. They're idealistic. They're like this utopian composers where how can I relate to being one of those Star Trek people? Whereas Beethoven is more like one of those Battlestar Galactica people. He's like a real guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Wagner, and certainly things like Ride of the Valkyries that was featured in the Coppola film Apocalypse Now, and I think of like some of is it Johann or Richard Strauss who did Thus Spake Zarathustra for 2001? Was that Richard?
Richard, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and those things are powerful and whatnot, But even when I listen to like some of that Strauss or Wagner, I always now, having listened to a lot more Beethoven, I always get a sense that they're sort of second-rate Beethovens, and it's probably unfair to say that. But for Wagner seems to have a lot of the sound and the loudness and the anger in some of the best of Beethoven, but he doesn't seem to have the deftness and the subtlety and the complexity that Beethoven could do. Beethoven could be loud and boisterous, but he could also be subtle and complex. And maybe I haven't listened enough to Wagner or Strauss, and again, I'm short shrifting them. But do you would you agree with that or what?
Well, the criticism with Wagner is always that he's too long. He didn't write any like piano sonatas. He didn't write like any overtures. I mean, he wrote these like 12-hour long things where I have friends of mine who are big Wagner fans. But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of it's opera for one thing.
Yeah.
So that means you have to tell a plot, you have dialogue, and you have to work through all of that. So it's not going to be like the hits one after the other. Like Beethoven is more like symphonies where it's the theme, developing the theme, doing a little solo, developing it more. Whereas with Wagner, he's telling the Lord of the Rings. He's telling a long story with a lot of characters, a lot of dialogue, and it's not going to be, it's not going to be like hit after hit after hit. So that's why it seems a bit, I guess, diluted to a lot of people. But you have to admit, Ride of the Valkyrie it's a great tune.
Yeah.
That is a great song. If you take Wagner in bits. If you edited him down to like singles, you could have a really good record. And there's people who've done that too.
Yeah. Well, let me just start wrapping things up here. And you had mentioned that you have done a number of other blogs. What are you currently blogging on, if anything, musically?
Well, I just wrapped up like I said, a blog on Alan Holdsworth, the guitar player.
Uh-huh.
And Alan Holdsworth is also kind of like an avant-garde but very human guitarist, where he's taking chords and combining chords at the same time, and his solos are kind of four-dimensional, I guess. His impeccable technique, and he played with a lot of different people from a lot of different bands and a lot of different styles. He played with everyone from Tony Oxley, who is a very art music jazz player, to Eddie Van Halen. So his career spanned such a broad spectrum of performers that it was really a fun project to do, to stretch my ears, to have to listen to all this English progressive rock, which I've never heard before. All the way up to fusion music, which I never listened to. So these projects always start out with I like this guy and let me learn more about him, and then it kind of blossoms into learning a lot about their friends and their influences. And actually, right now I'm doing a literary blog on H.P. Lovecraft, the writer. And besides his fiction, I'm also learning about the artists of Lovecraft, like Gustave Doré, Nicholas Roerich. There's all these artists I never heard of, but Lovecraft is saying these guys inspired me, so now I'm learning about that. So it's I think the best way to learn something is to prepare yourself to teach it. I always say, like, the smartest people are the teachers. Because if you have to teach a subject, you better know it. Otherwise, you would have to endure public humiliation, right? There's a lot of pressure to know a subject. So I always feel like if you really want to get to something well, intimately, then pretend that you have to teach it. And with Stockhausen, the other avant-garde composer, I like about 8 hours of lectures on Stockhausen a couple of years in Germany. And that was a great experience, because again, I had to force myself to be able to talk for that long and present materials and answer Q&A questions about it. And I should do something with Beethoven. I need to go back to Beethoven with a more sophisticated eye and redo all that. Really, I'll do probably in a few years.
Well, let me just ask a final question here, and then and I will link to your Beethoven blog, and you feel free to link this video there if you want. I'm looking at a post you did from 2010 where you asked who is today's Beethoven, and basically you sort of gave a few people like Jimmy Page and Trent Reznor, and one of the people down below had mentioned Frank Zappa when in a comment. Now that you have 7+ years on from that, do you have any further thoughts on that? Is there someone in classical music, or is classical music sort of like jazz, and it's sort of moribund, perhaps? I mean, I'm sure that there are people in the film world that, like you mentioned, Philip Glass, that are doing some things. But could anyone be a Beethoven in today's day and age?
Well, what's the Beethoven in today's age? It wouldn't be in the so-called classical world, because the classical world is, they're playing museum instruments essentially. I mean, Beethoven, when he was Beethoven, he wasn't playing museum instruments. He was playing, the equivalent of synthesizers and electric guitars and sequencers and things. He wasn't like one of those people. He wasn't like a like a folk musician playing Greek lutes or whatnot.
Yeah.
He was playing the most advanced technologically. He was playing the most technologically advanced musical instruments available to him at any given time. I mean, he was playing prototype pianos with expanded keyboards, right? And he was writing for instruments that weren't even for sale yet to the public. So it's a lot of these contemporary classical people. I think there's definitely a lot of progresses as far as integrating electronics and sequencers and tapes or whatnot into their music. But it still seems to be like a way to they're trying to keep a style of the past alive by putting sparkles on it or something. I think the real equivalent of classical music today is really in film music. Classical music, symphonies and whatnot, started from operas, and operas are now you have movies, right? We don't have operas. We have operas, but really, again, they're like basically trying to keep a vintage tradition alive. But movies are basically the storytelling vehicle for today's audience, and I think film music is probably the most effective popular music that people. I mean, listen to Star Wars. Outside of da 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 da, the big Star Star Wars is probably number 2, on the most famous melodies list. I'm sure there's all sorts of film score type things. So I kind of feel like whoever would be the modern Beethoven will be working in film music. And interestingly enough, when I wrote that post about who would be the modern Beethoven, I think my final choice was Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, mainly because he enjoyed the popularity that Beethoven did in his time. He was using the cutting edge of technology. He was creating music which influenced a whole movement of musical styles, and this was all true of Beethoven as well. And then a couple of years after I wrote that post, Trent Reznor started doing film music. He won an Oscar award for The Social Network. So I felt vindicated in that. He's still doing film music. He's done 5 or 6 scores now. So I don't know if I probably haven't really changed my mind as far as who the modern equivalent of a Beethoven would be. I think it would still be Trent Reznor. I mean, he's still young, and he probably hasn't created anything equivalent to a Ninth Symphony yet. But he's still young. He hasn't gone deaf yet, and we'll see how it goes. But I mean, Beethoven there's only there's not that many of them. I mean, they don't come around like every couple hundred years. I mean, Beethoven comes around once in a millennium or something. He's probably, to me, he's probably one of the greatest humans who ever lived. I mean, that sounds very dramatic, but the more you know about Beethoven, the more you study him, you realize it's profound how brilliant and how much he contributed to the human condition.
Well, I want to thank you, Ed, for spending about an hour and a half talking about Beethoven and music and giving your insights. So thanks very much, and I'll send you the link when it's up. Thanks a lot.
Great. Nice talk to you, Dan.